Welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, April 23rd, 2021. My name is Pam, and let's begin with our first article. Biden wants to tackle climate change. His pitch is all about jobs, by Stephanie Haynes. Gina McCarthy has a message. In press briefings and interviews over the past month, the blunt-talking White House National Climate Advisor, dubbed by some the Anthony Fauci of the environment, has repeated the same refrain again and again. It isn't about polar bears or melting ice caps or even protecting the earth for our children and grandchildren. Instead, Ms. McCarthy's message is about employment. When he hears the word climate, she says of President Joe Biden at a press briefing earlier this month, in a line that has become familiar, he thinks jobs. She went on to discuss the possibilities of new innovation, of grabbing back the supply chain we have lost offshore, and about growing millions of good-paying union jobs. We need to show people that America matters, that we are going to be leaders again, she said. She is far from alone in this rhetoric, which runs more campaign trail meets union than traditional environmentalism. Ever since President Biden unveiled his sweeping $2 trillion American job plan on March 31st, there has been a decided narrative shift among administrative officials advocating for climate action. Largely absent are the doomsday predictions and dire timetables for warming temperatures. In their place are breathless visions of an American-dominated electric vehicle industry, predictions of entrepreneurial innovation, and promises of clean energy independence. All of this, those who follow climate policy say, is intentional. In part, the goal is to win vital labor support for the administration's huge environmental investment proposal, an effort that shows some early signs of success. More broadly, the aim is to merge the long siloed policy areas of jobs and environmental protection. It's no longer the green economy, the clean economy. It's just the economy, says Ryan Fitzpatrick, director of the Climate and Energy Program at Third Way, a center-left think tank. So right now, it's not a conversation about whether we are going to, say, shift to electric vehicles. It's about how fast and how much can we get out ahead of that shift for workers, industries, and consumers. This, Mr. Fitzpatrick says, has been part of President Biden's approach to climate conversations ever since the campaign trail. Indeed, when President Biden introduced his American job plans at the Carpenters Pittsburgh Training Center, he mentioned the word climate only once. Instead, the focus was on jobs, a word he said 28 times, economic development, and infrastructure. The climate action in the proposal is largely intertwined with these goals. $174 billion to electrify the nation's transportation system, for instance, which would include a nationwide network of electric vehicle chargers, or $213 billion to produce, preserve, and retrofit affordable housing, which would include energy-efficient measures. Climate is integrated into everything, says Joel Jager, a climate research associate at the World Resource Institute. From making sure that buildings are resilient, to climate impacts, to retrofitting buildings to be more energy efficient. According to Mr. Jager's analysis, nearly $1 trillion of the plan would go to sectors that fall broadly under the umbrella of climate change, clean energy, and environmental justice. But as Ms. McCarthy said earlier this month, all of that is part of a very good economic policy. Money invested in retrofitting old buildings, restoring public transportation infrastructure, and developing an electric vehicle charging network, for instance, would reduce emissions, but also spark more innovation and allow for future growth, supporters say, all while providing millions of new jobs, the bulk of which do not require a college degree. Many unions have gotten on board with support, including some that opposed the Green New Deal resolution. That 2019 plan, generally seen as a politically left-wing proposal, attempted to merge environmental action with social justice goals, including employment. Lonnie R. Stevenson, for instance, international president of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, which opposed the Green New Deal, said the American Jobs Plan would be creating millions of good-paying union jobs, building a 21st century modern infrastructure, and a clean energy future for our nation. It will also spur a renaissance in Made in America manufacturing, bringing new jobs back to American communities, he said in a statement. Concerns remaining, however, on the right, many still connect climate actions to liberal environmentalist job killing, as Alabama Rep. Mike Rogers, a Republican, put it in a statement opposing Mr. Biden's proposal. On the left, some advocates believe that truly addressing climate change will require significant rollback of energy hog lifestyles and patterns of global capitalism, while others worry about how to ensure that green jobs offer living standards equal to the fossil fuel jobs they are replacing. In a February interview with Axios, AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka praised President Biden for hiring labor-attuned advisors, but lamented the administration's move to cancel the Keystone XL oil pipeline without a clear jobs plan for affected Plains state workers. Still, some researchers say investment in green infrastructure can create many more jobs than those lost in fossil fuels. Congress will be debating the details of the Biden plan. But one independent forecast by Moody's Analysis projects the U.S. economy will have 2.5 million more jobs in 2030 under the Biden infrastructure plan than without it. Amid the long-standing debate over the economics of combating climate change, some experts say the Biden team's effort to unite climate policy and jobs come as a relief. I've been pushing in this direction for a long time, says Stephen Cohen, a professor at Columbia University, who is the former executive director of the school's Earth Institute. Personally, I think part of the problem with people who study climate change is they want to make people do without in order to address the climate issues, and that, politically, isn't going to go anywhere. Far from being at odds, climate action and jobs have a positive relationship, Dr. Cohen and other researchers have long argued. A slew of studies from groups ranging from the Sierra Club to the business and environmental group E2 show that climate-related investment leads to job growth. And many advocacy organizations have been working behind the scenes for years, promoting both this approach to climate action and the collaboration between labor and environmentalists. We've had a very consistent message to both labor and the environmental movement that we have to come up out of our silos that have kept us apart and learn how to work together, says Joel Euling, president of the Labor Network for Sustainability. The environmental movement is now speaking out on jobs and worker protection policies in a way that is somewhat new and certainly reinvigorated in a big way. On the other side, there are a number of big unions that are moving on the climate issue. Increasingly, too, corporations have come to see unchecked global warming as a major threat to their future prospects, and a growing network of conservative-leaning clean energy organizations is promoting renewable power as an economic opportunity. To some extent, scholars say all of this might be moving the climate debate away from the identity marker it has been to a more classic policy debate, in which belief about climate change matters less than one's position on government investments and priorities. As Mr. Fitzpatrick says, you don't have to care about climate change to want to secure the supply chain for electric vehicles. Up next, no badges, no guns. Can violence interrupters help Minneapolis? By Martin Coods. A group of 20 men and women huddled outside a convenience store as steam rose from their paper coffee cups and the evening temperature dipped toward freezing. They greeted the occasional customer as they stood watch over the parking lot and nearby area, seeking to avert potential bloodshed without the aid of badges and guns. Known as violence interrupters, the team stops by the store 6 nights a week during a 5-hour patrol of Lake Street, a busy commercial and cultural corridor in South Minneapolis. Their approach to deterring conflict relies on quick thinking, calm persuasion, and a credibility that derives in part from who they aren't. If we looked and acted like cops, people would right away blow us off, says Mohammed Abdul Ahad. the team's leader and a longtime street outreach worker. The differences extend to uniforms. He opened his jacket to reveal a bright orange t-shirt bearing an outline of the city's skyline above the word Minneapolis, US, a one-word synopsis of the team's ethos. We can relate to people because we live here too, he says. We listen to them, and from showing them that empathy, they're willing to listen to us. Minneapolis has endured a spike in homicides, shooting, and other violent crimes since police killed George Floyd last May. The video of Officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on his neck for 9 minutes set off weeks of protests and deepened distrust within communities of color of the mostly white police force. The Office of Violence Prevention established the Interrupters program under the Minneapolis Us banner last fall as part of the city's evolving efforts to reimagine public safety and reduce dependency on traditional policing. 4 teams of 20 to 30 members, whose ranks include former felons and gang members, walk the street in high crime zones. Unarmed and lacking arrest authority, they stay alert for disputes between residents, young men in particular, and attempt to intervene before verbal taunts give way to fists or firearms. Their job is not to punish people, says Sasha Cotton, the office's director since its inception in 2019. It's about saving them. The work has gained greater urgency as Minneapolis braces for the outcome of Mr. Chauvin's trial on charges of second and third degree murder and manslaughter. Tensions in the city climbed last week after a white police officer in the adjoining suburb of Brooklyn Center shot and killed a black man, Dante Wright, during a traffic stop, igniting clashes between protesters and officers. As the unrest continued Monday, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz imposed an overnight curfew on much of the Twin Cities, and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey declared a state of emergency. The officer, Kim Potter, and Brooklyn Center Police Chief Tim Gannon resigned on Tuesday. For the members of Mr. Abdul Ahad's team, most of whom hold day jobs, the patrols represent a chance to sow goodwill as their city struggles to recover from the upheaval over Mr. Floyd's death. Antonio Williams, who joined the group for its nightly rounds after pulling his daily shift in a packaging warehouse, regards the late hours and variable weather as hardships worth tolerating for the safety of fellow residents. This is my neighborhood, my community, he says, and what we're trying to be is a buffer between order and chaos. Violence as public health crisis? Members of the Minneapolis City Council pledged to end policing as we know it. Last spring, in the aftermath of officers killing Mr. Floyd, the council later cut $8 million from the police budget to boost spending on public safety alternatives, and funding for the Office of Violence Prevention almost tripled, from $2.5 million to $7.4 million. The infusion of resources enabled the office to bolster existing initiatives to counter youth and gang violence and launch the Interrupters program. The growing emphasis on prevention strategies has occurred as city officials reassess a police department whose officers are 7 times more likely to use force against black residents than against white residents. We often ask law enforcement agents to be everything, Ms. Cotton says. The teams of interrupters, by diffusing conflicts before they explode, could ease the burden on officers and, in turn, lower the incidence of police violence. We've got to create a system that allows law enforcement to focus on things they're really good at. They do de-escalation, but it may not be their strongest skill. The funding for her office amounts to less than 5% of the $170 million police budget. The interrupters earn $25 an hour, and the city has committed $2.5 million to the program, with plans to expand and refine its operations this year. City Council member Philippe Cunningham, who prodded his colleagues to form the Violence Prevention Office 2 years ago, advocates for the Interrupters program as shooting and homicides rose across Minneapolis last summer. He describes the team as essential to teaching residents to view violence as a public health crisis that requires preventative remedies. When we talk about safety, folks tend to think that adding more officers is the only way to solve the problem, he says. Violence is a disease that spreads through communities, and it can be cured. But to do that, we have to look at solutions other than policing. The city has worked with Cure Violence to develop its interrupters program. Dr. Gary Slutkin founded the Chicago-based organization as Cease Fire in 1995, and in assisting dozens of cities to form similar programs that have yielded encouraging results. He has preached the merits of preemptive action. What usually leads up to violence? Somebody owes someone $10. Somebody insults someone at a party. Is retaliation, he said. That doesn't lend itself to doing something afterwards. You have to do something before. Dr. Slutkin, an epidemiologist by training, helped direct the medical response to AIDS and other global epidemics during his time with the World Health Organization in the 1980s and 90s. The Cure Violence model applies lessons from his experience. In the context of public safety, he explains, the interrupters serve as contact tracers. They draw on their past exposure to and understanding of violence as perpetrators, victims, or witness to detect conflict and coax people back from the brink. The interrupters have credibility and connections in the community. They can talk people out of what they're thinking of doing and get them to cool down, he says, and they can do that because people respect them. Change is possible. Mr. Abdul Ahad and his team shuffled in place to stay warm outside the Lake Street convenience store on a recent evening. They had walked several blocks west and returned, finding the sidewalks almost deserted. The cold spring weather, a parting shot from winter, had interrupted violence for the night. The lull provided opportunity for Mr. Abdul Ahad to recount a less sedate evening last fall. A man pulled into the shop's parking lot and stepped from his car. He pointed a handgun at another man standing on the sidewalk and began yelling about a woman they both knew. The team's members swarmed into action. In line with their de-escalation training, they moved into the space between the two men. Half of them faced the gunman and urged him to consider the lasting costs if he squeezed the trigger. The other interrupters shepherded the second man around the corner and ordered him an Uber ride. The gunman soon relented. The crisis receded. Nobody called the cops. You can't tell people what to do if you're not meeting them at the same level, says Mr. Abdul Ahad, whose time in prison on drug and money laundering charges a decade ago informs his approach. He now runs an auto parts delivery service, and his charisma and devotion to street outreach have earned him the nickname Mobama, a reference to the former president. You've got to respect people for them to respect you. The members of his hand-picked team have endured their share of adversity, including prison, homelessness, drug addiction, domestic abuse, and childhood trauma. The experiences animate their compassion for the people they encounter. Charles Andrew ran away from his Minneapolis home as a teenager to escape physical abuse. He drifted between the streets and the houses of friends for the next 2 years, and he recognizes the insidious forces, poverty, drugs, gangs, that can lure a young person towards the abyss of violence. Change is possible. I know that because I lived it, says Mr. Andrews, who works for a demolition company. He credits a friend's mother for pointing him toward a new future more than 2 decades ago. Sometimes people just need a chance to stop and think. That's why we're out here, to create that pause and plant that seed. A shift in thinking? An analysis in 2017 reveals that less than 10% of the Minneapolis police force lived in the city. None of the 4 former officers charged in Mr. Floyd's death lived here at the time of their firing last May. The members of Mr. Abdul Ahad's team take pride in their Minneapolis addresses, and their familiarity with the city breeds a familiarity with residents. They walk the beat in a manner once associated with cops, and passerbys greet them with waves, elbow bumps, and car honks. The response contrasts with the frayed relations between police and communities of color. I see the interrupters out there in their orange shirts, and I'm grateful, says D.A. Bullock, an activist and filmmaker who lives on the city's north side. Cops are always showing up after a shooting. There needs to be stronger engagement with young people to head off shooting. The rise in violent crimes has coincided with the departure of about 1/4 of the police force in the past year. In the aftermath of Mr. Floyd's death, when protesters rallied against police brutality and rioters set fire to the 3rd Precinct station, some 200 of the department's 850 officers retired, resigned, or took extended leaves. The loss of personnel has contributed to the department's homicide solve rate plunging below 50%. The wave of violence has managed scrutiny of the interpreters program and other public safety initiatives, says James Densley, a professor of criminal justice at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul. There is real pressure for the city to not just get it right, but get it right quickly. Because if they don't, people of color and communities of color will suffer the hardest consequences, he said. As the city weighs multiple proposals to reform or replace the police department, he adds residents inhabit an uneasy limbo. The problem is, until we have legitimately funded public safety programs, we have this void where you don't have full-strength policing and you don't have full-strength alternatives. A poll last summer found that 3/4 of residents support shifting a portion of police funding to anti-violence programs and social services. The same survey showed that a majority of residents oppose or remain uncertain about reducing the number of officers in the department. Mr. Densley suggests that their ambivalence arises from a misperception about the city's options. It's a false dichotomy to say that you have to defund the police to afford the community initiatives people are calling for, he says. You can have both well-funded public safety programs and police. What it requires is a shift in thinking about how to prevent violence. The ceasefire program earned praise for reducing gun violence in Chicago after it's launched a quarter century ago. But local and state officials slashed its funding in 2015 after police questioned the hiring of former gang members to curb crime and blamed the interrupters for inflaming community suspicion of officers. The city's homicide toll soared to 769 last year, its second highest total in the past 2 decades, and the pace of killings has continued so far in 2021. Reform advocates fault local officials for failing to provide more funding for interrupters and other public safety initiatives amid the bloodshed. You have to have the same commitment to these programs as you've had to the police, Dr. Slutkin says. That's what will lead to change. A mother's resolve. A light rail station on Lake Street marks the start of the route that Mr. Abdul Ahad's team patrols each night. One evening last month, as the interrupters neared the building, they noticed a man punching a woman. A few of the men stepped between the couple. Yolanda Royster placed an arm around the sobbing woman and guided her away to talk in private. The woman's anguish and fear reminded Miss Royster of her own while trapped in an abusive relationship several years ago. Memories surfaced of the struggle to exhale, to think, to imagine a way out. You're wondering what you did to deserve this, and you feel like there's nowhere to go, says Miss Royster, who grew up near the intersection where police killed Mr. Floyd. She consoled the woman before ordering an Uber to return her to the domestic violence shelter where she had stayed the past few weeks. The hope is that maybe we can help break that cycle. Miss Royster brings a mother's resolve to her work as an interrupter. The oldest of her 5 children is in prison for his role in a gang-related shooting, and she wants to spare other young men his fate. So, 6 evenings a week, she slips on her orange Minneapolis shirt and heads to Lake Street. She joins the team to walk the beat as they seek to reclaim the city, 1 block and 1 person at a time. It's important for people just to see us, to know we're out there, she says, especially right now when everybody's on edge. We want them to know their community cares about them. Continuing to our next article. In Maine, a small secondhand bookstore soldiers on, by Robert Close. The Dutch Renaissance humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam once wrote, "When I have a little money, I buy books, and if I have any left, I buy food and clothes." This thought came to mind as I drove through one of Bangor, Maine's poorest neighborhoods en route to a small, offbeat secondhand bookstore that distinguishes an otherwise careworn street and bears the lofty moniker Pro Libris Books. A practical person might ponder what essential service a bookstore provides to an impoverished neighborhood, which raises the question of what one considers essential. What a wonderful, wonderful thing to have a bookstore in one's midst, especially in a place where one needs many incessantly intercede. And in an electronic age when so many bookstores, whether of the small, independent, mom and pop variety or mega outfit like Borders, have evaporated from our communities seemingly overnight. Pro Libris Books is an unassuming but well-ordered cave of a shop occupying the ground floor of a peeling paint clapboard building. Its facade is adorned with a hand-lettered sign, its entrance flanked by a funky plastic chair in the form of a hand. The owner, Eric Fury, is there a more appealing name for a bookseller? Has plied his trade since 1980 and happily still turns a profit. Mr. Fury is small, septuagenarian, with an outsized crop of salt and pepper hair, touts his business as a reader's paradise. This seems to be enough to attract the rich variety of types I have observed there. High professionals, children, loquacious bookworms, students, college professors, and even, reflecting the neighborhood, a fair share of huddled masses yearning to read free. When I asked Mr. Fury if anyone notable has ever visited his shop, he quietly divulged appearances by authors Stephen King, William Kotzwinkle, Lynn Flewelling, and Allen Ginsberg, but he said this is reticence, as if unwilling to rank his clientele. As I wander the stacks, dividing my time between titles and observing the other visitors, I note the interplay between patron and proprietor. Not everyone is there to buy, but if I'm not mistaken in my interpretation of body language, my impression is that many are there to be, and I choose this word carefully, comforted. The familiar titles, the affordability of the volumes, the quirky touches, a coffin-turned bookcase from the set of a Stephen King movie, a bumper sticker announcing, "Maybe the hokey pokey is what it's all about," Mr. Fury's roaming cat, return to me the consideration of what we need, of what is indeed essential. When I am visiting Pro Libris Books, I find myself siding with celebrated author John Updike, who once said, "Bookstores are lonely forts spilling light onto the sidewalk. They civilize our neighborhoods." I think Mr. Fury would agree, as would his customers. When I broached the topic of necessity with him, he recalled a woman who gave him a $20 bill for a $9.50 sale and told him to keep the change, remarking, "I just don't want you to ever go away." And then there was the man who sent him $80 out of the blue because he was worried about how Mr. Fury was faring during the pandemic-induced lockdown. I asked about his survival secret. The answer? Low overhead and loyal clientele. The neighborhood might profit from, say, a supermarket, but the presence of Pro Libris Books and the community it serves is evidence that man, or woman or child, does not live by bread alone, and that it is important to go on caring, even and perhaps especially in parlous and uncertain times. Well, friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, April 23rd. My name is Pam. Thank you for inviting me into your home. Please stay safe until we meet here again, and be abundantly blessed today.